Hi, my name is Dr. Georgia Purdom, and I'm a research scientist, speaker, and writer for Answers in Genesis. I have a PhD in molecular genetics from The Ohio State University. In 2011, I was asked to accompany the group Living Science as they went on the field trip of a lifetime to the Galápagos Islands. Living Science is a Christ-centered homeschool study center that partners with parents to provide hands-on interactive studies of God's world. Of course, a trip to the Galápagos Islands is an amazing opportunity for any biologist, but especially for me, since one of my research goals is to understand how natural selection, mutation, and other mechanisms affect animal populations. The Galápagos Islands are quite literally a living laboratory for studying how these processes lead to adaptation and speciation. The Galápagos Islands were discovered in the early 1500s, but were made famous by the naturalist Charles Darwin. He visited the islands in 1835 during his voyage on the ship the Beagle. His study of the islands and other influences led him to propose that natural selection was the central mechanism leading to different species, such as different species of finches or different species of tortoises, which he encountered there. This idea was based on what he observed. However, Darwin took it one step further into the realm of the unobservable. He proposed that given enough time, such as millions of years, natural selection would cause one kind of animal to evolve into a different kind of animal, such as a dinosaur into a bird. These ideas about the past are of course contrary to the eyewitness account of God recorded for us in the first chapter of Genesis. God brought all living things according to their kind into existence from nothing by his spoken command. He did this in 6 24-hour days about 6,000 years ago. Now, when we use the word kind, which is a biblical term found in Genesis 1, we are typically referring to the family level in modern classification schemes. It is inferred from Scripture that animals reproduce according to their kind, and animals within any given family can usually mate with each other and produce offspring. For example, all dogs, including wolves, coyotes, foxes, and domestic dogs, all belong to the dog kind. Studying the Galápagos Islands can help us understand how God designed living things to adapt and thrive in the world, which has led to speciation. For example, all the different species of finches found in the Galápagos. What we discover on the islands gives no support for Darwin's idea that one kind of animal can evolve into a different kind of animal over millions of years. This video will focus on the two main groups of animals living on the Galápagos, birds and reptiles. The Living Science students will discuss some interesting facts they have learned about the animals we encountered, and I'll discuss how the animals have adapted and speciated on the islands. As you watch the video, keep in mind that we weren't filming under ideal conditions. We had to deal with a lot of wind, noise, blinding sun, settings like the cruise ship that were in constant motion, and as a result of all those things, a lot of bad hair days. First, let's define speciation, and then I'll give some examples of speciation currently occurring in the Galápagos.
Now, when you say speciation, only somebody who studied science understands that term. What does that term mean?
And even then, I'm not so sure how many of us, because the definition changes a lot of times, and it depends on the different, the organism that you're talking about. But generally, when we think of species, we think of organisms that can interbreed with one another, but aren't breeding with other organisms, so that they're just that particular species. That's how they define it. So they're not interbreeding with other animals. But again, how that's defined from microorganisms to birds to land animals varies a lot.
Any animal that comes to your mind that you would mention is a good example of speciation in the present?
Well, one in the reading that I was doing in preparation for this trip, I came across the mangrove finch, which is one of Darwin's finches. And it's actually a very rare finch. There's not a lot of them left, but there's two populations on Isabella, and the northern population and the southern population, and their song is actually becoming different, which obviously is going to affect courtship and mating. And they do believe that these organisms are starting to speciate as a result of that, because there's also distance between them, so that's part of it. But just based on the song, they think for conservation efforts that they may need to conserve both both the north and the southern populations because of this speciation. Another example may be the sea lions, actually, that are so prolific around here. The Galapagos sea lion is its own species, separate from the California sea lion, but in areas where both sea lions and fur seals exist, because they are after similar food types, what's going on there is what we call a form of resource partitioning. So they're actually, the fur seals are using one type of food, whereas the sea lions are using another type of food in order to be able to survive, both of them in the same area. So they're kind of developing their own niche. And as a result of that, we may be getting speciation in those sea lions that's different from other sea lions where they're not competing with fur seals. In this next section, we will discuss several of the bird species that we encountered in the Galapagos.
Did you see the Galapagos hawk when we were on Espanola?
Well, barely, because it's a very elusive species, so to speak. It's hard to find.
I managed to see just a beautiful specimen. And in fact, I think I saw two different ones. But I understood from the naturalist that that's the one island where the mating pair is really a pair, one female to one male. And on some other islands, there'll be more than one male to help take care of the babies.
You know, it's interesting, too, with the Galapagos hawk. It's actually considered one of the most inbred species of bird in the world.
Now, why?
Well, they don't like to fly long distances. So once they, by however means, reach the island, they don't leave the island. They stay on that island to breed with each other. And so what they're finding is, and the naturalists basically indicated this, that, you know, Hispaniola has its hawk and other islands have their own hawk, and it may be actually in the early stages of speciation because they're only breeding with one another. And what probably is leading to that, or one of the major factors leading to that, is genetic drift.
Okay, whoa. Genetic drift. This is another wonderful science word. What does genetic drift mean?
Well, genetic drift occurs in very small, isolated populations. At least that's where it occurs the most rapidly. It can occur in larger populations, but it's much more difficult. And what happens is, when we say genetic drift, it's the idea that it's drifting towards, the population is drifting towards a specific genetic makeup. In other words, in an original population, you might have several, and here's another word, alleles, okay?
Oh, yes. All right.
And that's varieties of genes, so to speak, of a particular gene. So you might have multiple alleles for a particular gene. Well, as the population only breeds within itself, and, you know, animals die, you start to lose that diversity.
So there's a loss of information with genetic drift.
Right. So you're getting one allele versus three alleles, so to speak, for a particular gene. And so what that leads to, that's what we call genetic drift. It's just essentially, you can just think of it like drifting towards a particular point. Now, selection can also play a role in that, natural selection, because certain alleles may be selected for or against in a particular environment. Now, we have to remember, though, that natural selection sees the individual as a whole. It doesn't see individual genes, so to speak, or individual alleles. But if that allele is significant enough to give it a significant change, so to speak, and it's you know, what we can see on the outside, its phenotype, its characteristics, then it may be selected for or against. So both of those things are probably acting in tandem. Now, another thing that could have a role with these populations is something called founder effect. And
Founder effect. Found.
Right. So if they were found by, or they were started by a very small population, say maybe one breeding pair, then you don't have a lot of genetic diversity to begin with, obviously. And so that can also lead to a very rapid fixation towards a specific genetic makeup in those animals.
These are wonderful words. I think all our students need to know these words.
Well, I tell you, the Galapagos is a great place to understand and see a lot of these genetic mechanisms leading to speciation in these organisms.
I'm excited about this. I can't wait to teach this to some of my students. That's wonderful. I think for me, seeing the blue-footed booby doing its mating dance was just incredible. You read about this kind of thing, and then when you see it, that's just spectacular. How do they get blue feet?
Well, they get the blue feet from the carotenoids that they take in through their diet. So it's kind of like gives a pigment, so to speak, helps them make the blue color. And what they do is they actually divert it to their feet so that it shows up. And the bluer the feet, the more attractive that is to the female. And it's actually a sign of health as well, because the more food they're taking in, the bluer the feet get. So it's a sign to the female that this is a very healthy male that she would want to mate with. It's amazing. You see why they got the name Boobies, because it just kind of looks like a person with big clown feet kind of trying to walk around, and it's kind of awkward, but yet to them, I mean, that's their courtship ritual, their courtship dance. And so God has designed them amazingly with this ability to interact with one another like this.
The blue-footed booby is best known for its torpedo bombing in the water. It can be 100 feet in the air, and it goes down in the water at 60 miles per hour, and it goes 80 feet under the water.
60 miles an hour when it hits the water?
Yes.
Okay, so why do its brains not like burst out every time it hits the water? I guess that would only happen once, but why do its brains not burst out?
Well, God has created air sacs that lines its skull, so it doesn't blow up.
That's amazing, kind of like the cars that we drive with air sacs. I tell you, there's no new thing under the sun. We get our ideas sometimes from what's already created. That's amazing. Now, it goes down very deep. Well, is it looking for food at the bottom?
No, ma'am. It goes under the fish because the fish can't look down. It snatches it up and eats it.
Okay, I can't do that when I dive because I get all this water up my nose. How can they do this?
Well, God has permanently closed their nostrils, so they breathe through the corners of their mouth.
So there's no water going up their noses at all when they do this. That's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Also, they have great eyesight, so that way they can see the fish.
So I've been seeing lots of birds around here, and they're kind of white and brown. Do you know what type of birds they are?
Those are Nasca boobies.
Oh, wow. Can you tell me a little bit about them?
Oh, sure. Those are the biggest boobies that are on the Galápagos Islands. They're 35 inches in length and have a wingspan of 5 feet.
Wow.
They have a white body, black wings and tail, and a long pointed bill. They also have a black mask around their eyes and bill, and they have large gray webbed feet.
This is the nesting ground for the Nasca booby as well as the red-footed booby. And this is a female sitting on an egg. And I just watched her turning and repositioning herself and the egg. Thank you for lifting yourself up so we could see your egg. That was very kind of you. Well, we just walked around the corner from where we saw the mama sitting on its egg. And here is a very proud mama with a hatched baby that's 1 month old. Just a little ball of fluff. Just across the road from where we saw the 1 month old, we're fortunate enough to come across a 3-month-old chick. It's certainly growing fast and it's stretching its little wings for us. It's posing.
I've been really wanting to see the flightless cormorant.
Oh, really?
But they have really small wings, only about 20% of their whole body length.
Wow.
But they can't really use them to fly.
I guess that'd
because
be
they're
like
so small in relation to their large body size.
That's amazing. So how do they eat?
Well, obviously they can't fly around and catch their food that way, but they do dive in the ocean, and they eat things like fish and squid and octopus.
So I've learned a lot about the flightless cormorant through my own studies, but I really wasn't able to find a lot from a genetic standpoint.
Well, there is a little bit known about the genetics of the flightless cormorant, and one of the things that is interesting, as you probably know, it has the most limited geographical distribution of any seabird. It only exists on 2 adjacent islands here in the Galapagos, and part of the reason for the fact that it's so isolated is obviously because it can't fly. It can swim, but it can't fly. And they are showing, though, even within those 2 populations on the adjacent islands, that there are genetic differences between those 2 populations. So they're probably undergoing a form of allopatric speciation.
What is allopatric speciation?
Well, allopatric speciation occurs, and most commonly you think of it associated with a geographical barrier, like a mountain or a volcano or something like that, where they can't get access to one another to mate. Now, in the case of the cormorant, the flightless cormorant, it's not occurring because of any actual geographical barrier like a mountain, but rather because they just simply can't fly from island to island to mate with one another.
So about the flightlessness, is it being selected for by the environment, or is it not being selected against?
Well, that's a really good question, and they obviously will have to do more studies to really determine what is the case. And is it that the environment, because they have a lot of food available in the ocean, so obviously it could be selected for, so that as you probably found in your studies, the way that the certain characteristics are expressed, it makes them good for swimming in the water and being able to get food from that. So is it being selected for, or is it that several thousand years ago when these when these birds came to the islands, a mutation occurred or several mutations occurred or something happened where they weren't able to, they lost the ability to fly. Well, that was okay because there was plenty of food in the water and they didn't need to fly, so it just wasn't selected against, and it became the dominant, it became the phenotype basically that was expressed by all of the cormorants there. Another really good example of that is the blind cave fish. They have the same question with those. I mean, they don't have eyes, but they live in a cave, so they don't need eyes. So is it being selected for? Because sometimes not being able to see also gives them a better ability to detect their environment without sight, or is it just not being selected against because they don't need eyes to see in a cave? So that's really a question that we have to look at a little bit more in depth with the cormorants to determine. Although Darwin's finches are considered an icon of evolution, we need to understand that the changes leading to different species of finches, resulting from natural selection and other mechanisms, are not the type of changes required for molecules to man evolution. The terms natural selection and evolution are often used synonymously, but they have distinctly different results. Evolution leads to directional change that over time results in one kind of organism changing into a different kind of organism, like a dinosaur evolving into a bird. However, natural selection leads to non-directional changes that over time result in variation and speciation within a kind, but not leading to a different kind of animal. For example, with Darwin's finches, the environment, including factors such as climate, predators, and food sources, favors birds with certain characteristics such as a long pointed beak or a broad dull beak. Those with the best suited characteristics will survive, and those without are less likely to survive, such that the population becomes dominated by a finch with a particular beak size. Should the environmental conditions change, a finch with a different type of beak may become dominant. What we do not observe is evolution in the sense of a directional change leading from a finch to a non-finch. We do observe variation within the finches that might eventually result in speciation.
So Dr. Purdom, we've seen so many species of finches out here, and I did a lot of research beforehand and tried to learn about the 13 different kinds. I mean, we have 3 different species of small ground finch, or we have a small ground finch, a medium ground finch, and a large ground finch. We have a small, medium, and large tree finch. We have a mangrove finch, a sharp-beaked ground finch. We have a cactus ground finch, a large cactus ground finch. We have woodpecker finch. I think that's about all of them. Mangrove finch, there we go. There's 13 of them, there's a lot. And every time we see them, I like to think I can identify them. But they're just so similar, and the thing that is just different is their beaks, and that's the only way I can really grasp onto that. Can you explain a little bit more about why we see the variation in the beak size but nothing else?
Well, at least among the ground finches and the cactus finches, they've done a lot of research to kind of determine the genetic factors, at least, that are responsible for this. We see a lot of variation in different characteristics among all the organisms on the islands, but the finches have been studied probably the most. And so at least as far as there's two main factors that are involved. There's a gene called BMP4, which BMP stands for bone morphogenetic protein. So it's kind of a big, so we just call it BMP4. That is responsible for the breadth of it, so to speak, the width, how broad it is. So that's one gene, and they find that in like the large ground finch, which has the big, really wide, broad beak, that it's expressed at very early stages and at very high levels in the embryonic tissue that's responsible for forming the beak. And as you go to the smaller ground finches, you don't see it expressed as early or as much, and so that's why they have their beaks are not as broad. Now, as far as the length goes, it's a completely different gene. It's the calmodulin gene, and that gene is responsible for calcium signaling. So all things associated with bones and that we would think of probably. And what they noticed there is, especially in a cactus finch, because it's specialized for feeding off the cactus, the flowers and such, and so it has a very long, sharp, pointed beak. It's expressed, again, at very high levels, and so you get a much longer beak than you do in some of the ground finches where you have a much shorter beak. And so what's neat about these two genes is that they act independently of one another, and so that's why you can get this huge variety of beak shapes and sizes in all of the finches. And so from the cactus finch that has a lot of the calmodulin, so it's very long, but very low levels of BMP4, so it's very narrow, to the large ground finch, which has very high levels of the BMP4, so it's very broad and wide, but very low levals of calmodulin, so it's very short. So it's amazing that gives the variety. And in any population here, even among the large ground finch, you're going to see some variation. And you want that because that allows the organisms to adapt to their particular environments, whatever the food sources might be, predators might be, so they can adapt very easily, not changing from one kind of animal into another kind of animal, but just allowing adaptation within that particular species or within that particular finch kind.
Okay, so you use the word adaptation. Can you explain kind of the difference of where we come from as creationists, seeing a divine designer behind the fingerprint of God in these finches, and what evolutionists believe? Where do the paths diverge?
Right, and that's the interesting thing here. We have, we were talking about before about the difference between what we're doing, which is observational science, and we can study what causes the changes in the beak shapes, the factors behind it, how the environment's affecting that. We can study that. That's observational science, and we can observe that, the species, we can see changes within the species, but not one kind of species becoming a completely different kind of species. And that's where we differ from the evolutionists, in that we believe in the variation within the species, or variation even within the kind, like the finch kind, but not, for example, a dog becoming a human being, or whatever. We don't see those kinds of changes, and there is no mechanism that can allow one kind of animal to change into a different kind of animal. There's no genetic mechanism, and that's probably the biggest factor, at least for me, the biggest piece of evidence that they're really missing. It doesn't matter how much time you give it, if you don't have a mechanism that allows you to add genetic information to go from one kind of animal to another, it will never happen.
Okay, so I read a lot about mutations and things within species. Is that a way that there could possibly be an introduced amount of genetic information that could cause these variations?
Well, mutations, what we have found, everything that we've observed to this point shows that they don't add genetic information. They either take away or they just allow an alteration of it, but not adding the information that you need to go, for example, from a bacteria to a human being. Because you can't just tweak the DNA or mutate the DNA that's there. You've got to seriously add some major amounts of genetic information, like how to make brains, eyeballs, all of that, in order to get to a human being.
This whole time I've been thinking, I forgot the warbler finch. It's one of my favorite ones. It's the easiest to identify because of its song.
That's right.
We've seen so many finches on all of the islands. Do you have anything interesting about them?
Well, Darwin's finches are probably one of the most studied organisms on all of the Galapagos Islands, and there are a lot of different species of them, and they're a great example of adaptive radiation.
Now, what is adaptive radiation?
Well, adaptive radiation occurs when an organism goes to different areas that are very different environmentally speaking or ecologically speaking, and they basically adapt and become specialized for that particular environment.
Oh.
So you see that. I mean, we know there are a lot of different environments represented here on the islands, not only between islands, but also within the island. And so you get a lot of different species, like the cactus finch versus the ground finch versus the tree finch versus the warbler finch. I mean, you get a lot of, and even with those, within those you have several different species. So there's a lot of those things that are developing here on the islands.
Now, you know something about the warbler finches too.
Right, and it's very unique. These are part of Darwin's finches, and so there's two known species right now, Olivacea and Fusca. Those are the two species named. Now, they used to be considered one species because they looked so similar. They were similar morphology and similar behavior.
And when you say morphology, I understand that, but not everybody understands what morphology is. What's the morphology?
So what they look like kind of on the outside, beak size, coloration, things that we can physically see. So they used to be considered one species, and then when they started doing genetic studies, they actually divided them into two species, and which is kind of interesting with this particular bird because they call this an example of cryptic speciation. Okay?
There's another good word.
Hidden, kind of cryptic, meaning hidden speciation, because on the outside, they look very similar. They act very similar. But on the inside, when you look at their DNA, they're very different. And it seems to be related to the habitat. So they can be, for example, on, I think it's on Darwin Island. Yes, on Darwin Island and Hispaniola, which we know are very far apart. Very far apart. The habitat is very similar there. And so the species is the same that resides there, okay, even though they're very, very far apart. Whereas on Isabela and Amanos, which are two very close islands, they're different species because they have very different habitats there. Yeah. So even though they're very close, there doesn't seem to be they don't seem to be breeding with one another, so to speak. So you've got two different species.
So it's completely unrelated to the distance of the islands. You would base that on the environment.
On habitat, yes. So it seems to be. And it's very different from the other finches, which in the other finches, they're very similar genetically, but very different in behavior and morphology. So you see something completely different. So there's a lot of variety.
Is there a word for that too? I like that.
I don't know if they have a word. That's just normal. That's so to speak. Yeah, normal speciation. But it's really interesting just to see the variety that I think that God has put in His organisms, the creatures that He created, and how they're even changing. I mean, there's not just one way. There's all these ways that we're still finding out. In this next section, we will discuss several of the reptile species that we encountered in the Galapagos.
Holt, the land iguana is one species we've been seeing a lot of here in the Galapagos. Ever since Darwin's time, there's been a lot around, but since his time, there's actually less than there were. He wrote that there were so many that he couldn't find a place to pitch his tent because their burrows were just everywhere. Yeah. But now, since feral goats and other feral species have been introduced, the vegetation they eat has been reduced and their nests have been trampled at times, so their population is a little bit less. And they're solitary, so we don't see them in groups like the marine iguana. But the best way to compare them is actually really to talk about the differences between the land and marine iguana.
Yes, and one of the major differences is the coloration of the land iguana opposed to the marine iguana. We see that the land iguanas are a yellow to brown color, and that they do not have to keep a certain body temperature as the marine iguanas, and that's why their skin is black. But it's also a result of the food they eat, their diet.
Yeah, that's true. You see, they eat more of the cactus pads that fall off the Puntia cactus we see here in the Galapagos instead of the algae off the rocks like the marine iguana, which also has to do with their size. The land iguanas tend to be much larger than the marine iguanas because they spend more time each day eating because they don't have to sun themselves on the rocks to keep that 35 degrees Celsius body temperature.
And that reminds me of their teeth. We know that the marine iguanas have a tricuspid, really sharp tooth, so they can get that algae off the rocks. Now, the land iguana has a very blunt tooth, so it can crush the land vegetation.
Yeah, their snout is also a little bit more pointed and less blunt because they don't have to scrape those rocks clean. But that's not the only differences we see. We see their claws are also different. They're not the same sharp claws that the marine iguana has to stay onto those rocks when the waves wash over them. And they also have different tails. Their tails are a bit rounder because they don't have to propel themselves through the water with the flat tail like the marine iguana does.
Okay, we have the cactus around here. This was too much water and the cactus fell off. But you can see how the iguanas eat around this place. So there's a little holes on the leaves are the iguanas that stand in the back legs and just bite the leaves that are really low and close to the floor. Actually, a little bit of this cactus, But around this time, we didn't have too much problems because the water they find everywhere. This is the end of the rainy season, so then later on they're going to have a problem with the water, so they're going to come back again over here and try to bite those leaves, around this place, and also the fruits of the cactus.
I was really excited to see the marine iguana. It's actually endemic to the Galapagos, meaning it's only found here and nowhere else naturally.
Oh, amazing.
It's also the only seagoing lizard in the world.
There's a population of roughly 200,000 to 300,000 here in the Galapagos, which means experts aren't really worried about it becoming extinct or endangered anytime soon.
Nope. And they're found in aggregations of 10 to 1,000 individuals.
And you'll find those aggregations somewhere on the rocks, the cliffs, or ledges, and sometimes intertidal flats, specifically on the southern ends of islands where the wave action is increased, because that will deposit more algae, which they like to eat. They eat 9 different types of algae, both green and red.
What about the brown? I've seen a lot of brown washed up on the beaches here.
The brown algae is actually toxic to them, and during El Nino years, when the current's warmer and being brought up from South America, that will actually deposit more brown algae, which is going to thin out the population of iguanas because they have nothing else to eat.
Well, I was thinking about something. When I went snorkeling, I had on this wetsuit, and so I stayed very warm in that cold water. How do these iguanas stay warm in the water? I mean, how long do they stay in the water? Isn't that going to be harmful?
Well, you see, the temperature difference is more pronounced for the iguanas because they're ectotherms, meaning they're cold-blooded.
Okay.
And since they strive to maintain a body temperature around 35 degrees Celsius, it gets to be a problem when they dive into the water. They'll dive in the water for up to 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the day, and they'll dive up to depths of 10 to 15 meters. The water gets pretty cold. And when they do that, they'll lose up to 10 degrees Celsius of their body temperature.
That's a lot.
When their temperature is that low, they can't metabolize their food, so it just sits in their stomach undigested. In order to fix this, they will sunbathe and things like that, but they can also shunt blood away from their body while they're diving, and that keeps their body a little bit warmer. They also like to sleep in huddles at night as another way to conserve heat amongst the group or aggregation.
So like on top of each other? Because I thought I saw some of
Really
that.
close, on top, everywhere.
Okay. That's just absolutely incredible.
Right now we're on Isla Tintoris off of the Isabella, the mainland of where we're at right now in the Galapagos. Right here we have a large aggregation of marine iguanas that we've been studying for a long time now, and really exciting to see them. They're a little bit different from the ones we saw on Espanola and Floriana. Those had a little bit of a red color to them around their stomach and along their back, but these don't have that color. They're only black, dark gray. The males have a little bit of green, and that all has to do with what kind of algae they're eating that's been deposited by the waves on the coast for them to eat. We also can see here the impressive spines on the back of the male marine iguanas. They're a bit bigger than the female, and they're only present on the marine iguana. The land iguana does not have those spines along the back just like that. But I think the most unique thing is probably the white stuff on their forehead.
Yes, as you can see on this big guy to my left right here, you can see this white, almost barnacle-looking material on its head. And now what that is the salt or the brine that it shoots out of its nostrils when it's trying to get rid of excess salt. Since its diet consists of red and green algae, it takes in a bunch of salt. And so to get rid of that, so it doesn't damage its body, it'll shoot it out of its nostrils, and then it'll land back on its head. So that's why a lot of these iguanas have that white barnacle-looking material on their head.
Right now we have the opportunity to see some marine iguanas in one of their habitats. They are currently on an intertidal flat.
What we are observing here is they're feeding. Right now, this one particular iguana is feeding on green algae that is located on the rocks. Their diet consists greatly of the marine algae. There are 9 different types, and like I said, we are observing them eating green algae right now. The smaller marine iguanas tend to stay in the intertidal zones during high tide, and they will not go out until low tide. And the larger ones will occasionally dive into the deeper waters at high tide. However, they will eat crickets or grasshoppers and occasionally crustaceans from time to time.
Now, we've seen 2 different types of iguana. We've seen the marine iguanas and we have seen the land iguanas. They're just both fascinating, but did these come from a common ancestor, do you believe?
Well, we believe that they did. They probably started out as a land iguana, and then the marine, so to speak, abilities have sort of developed over time. Now, we're not talking some major changes in these iguanas, because it's not. One of the things that we see, for example, is a marine iguana has to have the ability to maintain its body heat, even when it's very, very cold in the cold waters. Well, it can do do that because of some special thermal stable abilities that it has to keep the heat, but all iguanas have that. It's just much more developed in marine iguanas because they need that when they go under the water.
So even the land iguanas would have that mechanism,
Right.
they just don't utilize it in the same way.
Yes. So we would call that as creationists an example of mediated design. It's there, the information is there, it just becomes developed or expressed more depending on the environment. Another example is the salt glands. Okay, so marine iguanas have to have the ability to they don't drink fresh water, so they have to have the ability to get rid of the salt in the water that they take in, and they can do that. But even land iguanas have salt glands. They're just not very well developed. So just two really good examples of they have that ability. And again, when they got to the islands, there's not a lot of food. I mean, it looks really green now, but that's because it's the wet season. The wet season has just ended. But even in a few days or weeks, this won't look green anymore. And so they had to have the ability to get food somehow. So, the Lord designed them with those capabilities to be able to adapt and do that.
It's so easy when you're coming from the perspective of understanding that we have a creator and he designed and created these creatures to see how they've survived. It's very hard for me to understand how we think this could have just randomly happened and yet we still have all these populations.
Well, again, how much time would that have taken to develop a salt gland or whatever to be able to, or even to get it to express more and be able to utilize it? Those organisms would have died in the process, and so they wouldn't have survived.
Here we have an example of a Galapagos giant tortoise. This is the species found on Santa Cruz Island. As you can see, it is a domeback. This is because the elevation of the vegetation around Santa Cruz is fairly low to the ground, so it doesn't have to stretch its neck as high to eat its vegetation. Right now, it's in a small pond, possibly for thermoregulatory reasons to keep its temperature at a certain area, or also to keep the parasites off of it. This specimen is probably a male based on its size alone. They can reach weights of up to 600 pounds. They are extremely slow creatures. They move at a rate of about 16 feet per minute, or 0.18 miles per hour. They spend about 2 hours a day in the morning sunning themselves, and then 8 to 10 hours feeding and about 16 hours sleeping each day. So they're very slothful creatures. In order to maintain their body temperature or body weight, they'll eat up to 70 or 80 pounds of vegetation every day, as we saw earlier with another specimen. They just eat just about anything, but they're strictly herbivorous, so they're going to eat the vegetation, not insects, not any other animals around the Galapagos. They're considered basically the kings of the Galapagos. They don't have any natural predators, except for some introduced feral species which compete for vegetation with them. Otherwise, they are free from being preyed upon. That's only true for the adults. The adults have a large carapace, as you can tell, that is fused with the skeleton on the rib cage, but the babies are much more vulnerable as they're younger, with softer shells and easier targets for things such as Galapagos hawks, and eggs are also easily poached by snakes and other creatures found around the Galapagos.
Okay, so we're in the reproduction center of the Darwin Foundation. Actually, together with the National Park, they are working with 4 species from 4 different places. One is from Española, Santiago, Santa Cruz, and also Pinzon Island. And all those places, we used to have big problems with introduced animals. Like, for example, in Santa Cruz, we still have some goats, pigs, and cats, and actually is a problem for the giant tortoises. The same thing in Pinzon, for example, the black rat, they ate the babies, and actually they didn't reproduce for 50 years, no babies for 50 years. So this is why they reproduce in here in the center. For Española is a different problem. In Española, they actually found only about 12 females, and actually this is was very bad to meet with the males, only 2 males, and this is why they put all of them together here in the center, and they reproduce in this place.
Here at the Galapagos National Park, they take many precautions to help aid the growth and birth of many giant tortoises. They will collect eggs from both the wild and within their own center, but when they do so, they have to be very careful and mark the eggs as to which side is up and which side is down, and carry them to their center, to their own incubators, and put them in the same orientation as they were when they were found in the nest, because that way it will keep the embryo just as it was when it was the egg was laid. If they don't do this, it's very possible that the embryo could die, and that would create a failed nest, and that would obviously be detrimental to the process of growing the population of Galapagos giant tortoises. Out here in the Galapagos, we've seen so many amazing islands, and we're pretty sure that they were created during the flood, you know, with all the fountains of the deep bursting forth, and it's really a product of what we believe to be the Genesis flood. But it makes me kind of wonder, how did all these species get here, and what kept other species from getting here, especially the Galapagos giant tortoise? I mean, it's so large. Is it a good swimmer? Did it just float across the ocean? How exactly does that work?
Well, it's a really good question, and what we would say, you know, as creationists and in the models that have been developed, that again, like you said, the islands themselves probably formed shortly after the flood and a lot of volcanic eruptions and activity that was going on. And at that time, too, on the surface, we believe there were a lot of large rafts of debris, you know, from plant life and animal life and all of these things that were, you know, destroyed as a result of the flood. So we see a lot of debris on the surface of the water. And so that's probably how a lot of these animals got to the islands, was just by rafting on these large rafts. Now, the larger the raft and the bigger it is, obviously the larger the animal it can support. And so initially you probably had a lot of the larger animals that we see here on the islands coming. And then over time, as the rafts got smaller, then you get the smaller animals, like smaller birds and things like that, coming to the island. Now, it's a really interesting question about whether the tortoises were giant before they came to the islands or became giant as a result of living on the island. And most people believe that they were giant before they came to the islands, that it would be really kind of a prerequisite in the sense of they can go a long time without food and water, as we've talked, even months, you know, with some of these giant tortoises. And also, the larger they are, the more they can hold their head above the waters, and so that might help them as they're coming to be able to live on the islands.
Okay. So the tortoises are obviously pretty big, but we still see some variety. We see the domebacks, and those are supposed to be on the larger islands with more wetlands, but we have the saddlebacks, and those are generally on the drier, smaller islands. Why exactly is that?
Yes, and again, an interesting question in trying to determine exactly what causes them to have the different shell shapes. We don't know from a genetic standpoint, but as far as the saddleback morphology is concerned, they believe that again, that helps them when the food is again scarce and kind of loaded, or not low to the ground, but where they have to kind of reach up. Since there's not a lot low to the ground, they have to sort of reach up more. So that particular shell shape allows them to reach up better. The other thing is we know with tortoises, as we've seen, how they show dominance is they raise their necks. The higher they can raise their necks, because they can't really fight, so the higher they raise their necks, the more they show to be the dominant one. So that might be an advantage when there's very scarce food, and to be able to, scarce mates, to be able to show the dominance a little bit better in the saddleback morphology. Now the domed, like you said, the dome morphology is found more on islands where food is and vegetation and, you know, the mates are very abundant, and so they don't need that particular morphology in that case.
We got to see some of the tortoises out in the wild, but most of what we've seen was in the Charles Darwin Research Station in the Tortoise Reserve. And I think the one we were all looking forward to seeing was Lonesome George,
right.
The last of the Pinta. And they talked about how they were going to try to kind of revive the Pinta species even after Lonesome George passed on by interbreeding him with some tortoises that had like 80% of the gene that Pinta tortoise would have, and those are just from interbreeding of other tortoises. Mm-hmm. Is there any other species like that, maybe some of the species they thought to be extinct that they're still trying to reintroduce into the Galapagos?
Well, there is. There's the Floriana species. Now, when Darwin visited Floriana, he did not see any living tortoises on Floriana, but he did find the remains of them, including their shells. And so we believe that there was a Floriana species of tortoise. And fortunately, some people at some point came along and collected some of the shells, and they ended up in a museum. Well, what they decided to do was to take the DNA from those shells, because it's well preserved in there, take it and analyze it and look at it and compare it to the genetic makeup of other tortoises. And what's really interesting is they found that on Isabella, around Volcano Wolf, that they had some tortoises there that were mixed ancestry. They couldn't figure out where the other part was coming from, and when they compared it to the Floriana DNA, they found that it's very similar to that. So they believe that those are sort of part Floriana, part Isabella volcano wolf. And so what they're trying to do now is take those into captivity, those of mixed ancestry, and breed them together in the hopes of being able to resurrect, at least to some extent, the Floriana species and then reintroduce them to Floriana.
That makes sense. So I guess it's pretty cool to see them actually trying to, revert the Galapagos back to their original pristine form before humans came and, the whalers took so many tortoises and they were the cause of extinction for so many.
Yeah, so it'll never be perfect, but it does tell us the importance of, again, conservation and even preservation of some of these, like the tortoise shells and things like that in museums, so that later when we have the technology, we can study these things and hopefully, again, like you say, be able to turn these back to more of their original state.
Pretty cool.
I hope you've enjoyed this journey to the Galápagos Islands. As a biologist, it was a tremendous opportunity for me to see up close the wonderful diversity of life that God has created. Studying the animals and plants on the islands gave me insight and appreciation for God's incredible design for life to adapt and speciate and thus preserve life in a fallen world. In Romans 1, Paul writes in verse 20, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." God says that he can be known through what he has created, and God's intelligence, care, creativity, and many other attributes are clearly displayed in the Galápagos Islands for all to see and know there is a Creator God.